They say that money can't buy happiness, but it can certainly purchase a very special kind of tragedy. The kind that turns love into ash and loyalty into a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. This particular tragedy began on a bleak Tuesday afternoon, under a sky the color of old slate. There, on the cracked pavement of a quiet suburban street, stood Arthur Miller, a man of 62 years whose hands were a roadmap of a lifetime spent shaping wood. Beside him, 2 black trash bags slumped pathetically, holding the sum of his worldly possessions. He wasn't looking at the bags. His gaze was fixed on the front door of the modest, 2-story house in front of him, his house. The house he had built with those same hands, beam by beam, nail by nail. A locksmith, a young man who refused to meet his eyes, was diligently changing the locks. Inside, framed by the living room window she had once decorated with finger paint masterpieces, stood his daughter, Eleanor. At 28, she was the spitting image of her late mother, but the warmth that had defined his wife was gone from her eyes. In its place was a chilling, resolute emptiness. Just yesterday, Eleanor, or Ellie, as he had always called her, had become a millionaire. A sum of $33 million had been wired into her bank account, an inheritance from a maternal grandfather she barely remembered. And her very first act, her first grand gesture as a woman of wealth, was to evict her own father. Arthur felt no rage. There was no fire, no burning indignation. There was only a hollow, numbing cold that the autumn wind couldn't account for. It was a cold that seeped into his bones, into the marrow of his soul. This was the child he had raised alone since she was 5, the one for whom he had worked until his back ached and his fingers bled. Every splinter, every sacrifice, every quiet, lonely evening had been a brick laid in the foundation of her future. And now, that future had arrived. It was a grand, opulent palace, and it had no room for its architect. He stood there, on the outside, watching the door to his own life being locked, and wondered how a bond forged in love could be so utterly shattered by the weight of paper. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you must first understand the man who was betrayed. Arthur Miller was not defined by what he owned, but by what he created. His world, his sanctuary, was a small workshop behind the house, a place that smelled perpetually of pine, cedar, and sawdust. This scent clung to his clothes. It was embedded in the lines on his hands. It was the incense of his life's work. He was a master carpenter, a man who believed in the gospel of grain and grit. He could look at a raw plank of oak and see the table it was meant to become, could feel the hidden strength in a piece of walnut and know the chair it would support for generations. He didn't just build furniture, he built legacies. He spoke the language of wood, a language of patience, honesty, and integrity. There was no cheating the grain, no shortcuts to a perfect joint. A thing was either true or it was not. He had lived his entire life by that simple, unyielding code. His greatest creation, however, was not made of wood. It was the life he built with his wife, Clara. She had been a ghost in Ellie's memory, a warm smile in a faded photograph. But for Arthur, she was the silent echo in every empty room. Clara had come from a different world entirely, a world of polished marble and whispered obligations. She was the daughter of a ruthless New York industrialist, a man who measured his life in stock prices and acquisitions. He saw Arthur as little more than a laborer, a quaint but unacceptable diversion for his only child. But Clara saw something else. She saw the quiet strength in his hands, the steadfast honesty in his eyes. She found more beauty in the controlled chaos of his workshop than in all the sterile art galleries her father had dragged her through. Their love was a quiet rebellion, a choice she made not with shouted defiance, but with a simple, unwavering conviction. Her father had presented her with an ultimatum, delivered with the cold precision of a corporate negotiation. It was Arthur, or it was the family fortune, the name, the legacy. She could not have both. Clara, without a moment of hesitation, chose the carpenter. She walked away from the endless millions, from the suffocating expectations, and never looked back. Their life together wasn't extravagant, but it was rich in ways her father would never comprehend. It was rich with the smell of fresh-baked bread on a Saturday morning, with the shared laughter over a simple dinner, with the profound peace of knowing you were loved for who you were, not for what you represented. They built the house together, her gentle guidance softening the rugged edges of his practicality. It was more than a structure of wood and nails. It was a monument to their choice, a fortress against the cold world she had left behind. The fortress, however, could not protect them from fate. Cancer came for Clara like a thief in the night, silent and merciless. Arthur watched the love of his life fade, her vibrant spirit dimming day by day. He held her hand through the grueling treatments, his stoic silence, a testament to a heartbreak too deep for words. In her final days, she made him promise. "Raise her to be kind, Arthur," she had whispered, her voice as fragile as a dry leaf. "Raise her to know the value of a hard day's work. Don't let my father's world ever poison her." Arthur had sworn he would, a sacred vow made in the hushed quiet of a hospital room. When she was gone, the silence she left behind was deafening. But in that silence, he had a purpose. He had Ellie. He poured all the love he had for Clara, all his grief, all his hope, into raising their daughter. He was both the anchor and the sail of her small world. He was the one who patiently taught her to ride a bike, whose large, calloused hands were surprisingly adept at braiding her hair. He was the one who attended every parent-teacher conference, feeling awkward and out of place in his work clothes, among the slick suits and designer dresses of the other parents. He built her a dollhouse that was a perfect miniature of their own home, crafted a rocking horse that became her trusted steed on countless imaginary adventures. The rhythmic rasp of his hand plane and the steady beat of his hammer were the lullabies of her childhood. He never spoke of her mother's family, never mentioned the wealth she had forsaken. He wanted to shield Ellie from that world, to honor Clara's last wish. Their life was their own, built on a foundation of love and mutual respect. He wasn't just her father. He was her hero, her confidant, the unwavering center of her universe. Or so he had believed. He had tried to build a seawall of love around her, a barrier of simple truths and honest work, to protect her from a tide of greed he knew, one day, might come rolling in. He just never imagined that she would be the one to tear the wall down. The seed of that new, terrible world arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between a bill for the electric company and a flyer for a local pizzeria. It was an envelope unlike any they had ever received. It was thick, made of heavy, cream-colored paper, and bore the name of a prestigious Manhattan law firm, embossed in elegant, severe lettering. It felt alien in Arthur's calloused hands, a dispatch from a planet they had only ever read about. Arthur felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. It was the same feeling he got when he saw a hidden rot in a piece of timber. Ellie, however, saw it as an object of fascination. Her life had been a straight, predictable line, and this envelope felt like a sudden, thrilling curve. They opened it together at the kitchen table, the one Arthur had built for their small family decades ago. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but the core message was clear. Conrad Sterling, Clara's father and Ellie's maternal grandfather, was dead at the age of 89. The news landed with no emotional impact. He was a phantom to them, a name connected only to old pains. But then came the second part. As his only living direct descendant, Eleanor Miller was named the sole heir to his estate. The words that followed seemed to hum on the page, vibrating with a power that felt both intoxicating and profane. The liquid assets of the estate were valued at $33 million. The number just sat there in the air between them, absurd and incomprehensible. $300 for a new table saw was a major expense for Arthur. $33 million was a figure from a movie, a number without reality. For Arthur, the number was a shadow. It was the price his wife had refused to pay, the golden cage she had escaped. He saw not opportunity, but the long, cold reach of a man he despised, a hand stretching out from the grave to reclaim what he believed was his. He looked at Ellie, and for the first time, he saw a stranger looking back at him. Her eyes, usually so full of familiar warmth, were wide with a kind of feverish, ecstatic disbelief. She wasn't seeing a shadow. She was seeing a sunrise, a golden, glorious sunrise that promised to burn away the simple, gray world she had always known. It was the first, hairline fracture in the foundation of their lives. And then came Julian. He entered Ellie's life just as this new reality was taking root, and he moved with the predatory grace of a shark that smells blood in the water. Ellie had met him a few months prior, but in the wake of the news, he became a permanent fixture in their home. Julian Vance was his name, and he called himself a financial consultant. He was everything Arthur was not. He was polished, articulate, and wore suits that cost more than Arthur's truck. His smile was wide and brilliant, but it never seemed to warm his eyes. He spoke a hypnotic language of portfolios, asset diversification, and capital growth, a language that mesmerized Ellie and made Arthur's head spin. To Arthur's practiced eye, Julian was like a piece of cheap particle board with a fancy, photorealistic veneer. It looked like solid mahogany from a distance, but he knew that under the slightest pressure, it would turn to dust. Julian's strategy was masterful in its insidious simplicity. He never openly criticized Arthur. Instead, he reframed Arthur's love as control, his wisdom as fear. He would listen patiently to Arthur's cautious advice about lawyers and accountants. Then later, in private, he would turn to Ellie and say things like, "He means well, of course. He just doesn't understand this world. He's afraid of what he can't build with his own two hands." He started planting poisonous seeds, whispering about her potential, about the legacy she could build. "This isn't just money, Ellie," he'd say, his voice a conspiratorial murmur. "It's freedom. It's a chance to be the person you were always meant to be, without limitations." The unspoken implication was clear. Arthur, and the life he had provided, was her limitation. The house became his primary target. It was the physical embodiment of Arthur's love, the fortress of their shared history. Julian saw it as a symbol of the past that needed to be demolished. He presented it to Ellie as a legal hurdle. "The estate's lawyers," he explained, his tone laced with false concern. "They're going to look at your entire situation. They need to see you as a serious, independent woman, taking control of her assets. The fact that your father's name is still on the deed to your primary residence, it looks messy. It suggests dependency." He made it sound like a simple piece of administrative tidying up, a formality required to unlock her glorious future. He convinced her that this act was not about taking something from her father, but about securing everything for herself. The final conversation was brief and brutal. Ellie approached Arthur one evening, her speech rehearsed, her eyes avoiding his. She recited the lines Julian had fed her about legal clarity and the expectations of the estate. Arthur listened, and every word was a hammer blow to his heart. This wasn't his daughter speaking. It was a parrot, mimicking the soulless jargon of a vulture. He saw the desperation in her, the frantic desire to believe the fantasy Julian was selling, and his lifelong instinct to give her what she wanted waged a war against his better judgment. He tried to reason with her, to make her see that their home was more than an asset, that it was their heart, but she met his pleas with a cold, defensive wall. "It's just a piece of paper, Dad," she said, the words sounding foreign and cruel coming from her lips. In the end, a lifetime of love proved to be his greatest weakness. He could not believe, would not allow himself to believe, that his own child, the little girl whose scraped knees he had bandaged, was capable of such a calculated betrayal. He believed he was helping her take the next step in her life. And so, at the small desk in his workshop, surrounded by the honest scent of sawdust, he signed the paper. The scratch of the pen was the only sound. It was the sound of a lock clicking shut, the sound of a lifetime of trust being signed away for a fantasy. He slid the deed transfer form across the desk to her, and in that moment, he had given her not only the house he had built, but the weapon she would use to cast him out of it. The week that followed the signing of the deed was a masterpiece of quiet cruelty. On the surface, nothing changed. Arthur still rose before the sun, his routine a comforting rhythm in a world that was beginning to feel off-key. He still went to his workshop, the scent of cedar, a familiar greeting. But a chill had settled over the house. Conversations with Ellie became clipped, functional. She was constantly on her phone, speaking in hushed, excited tones with Julian, using words like escrow and liquidity that felt like a foreign language on her tongue. The warmth had been bled from their interactions, replaced by a polite, brittle distance. Arthur felt like a guest in his own home, a ghost haunting the hallways of a life that was no longer his. He told himself it was temporary, a strange transition phase as she adjusted to her new reality. He was wrong. The final blow came without warning. It was on that bleak Tuesday afternoon. He returned from delivering a custom-built bookcase, his muscles tired but his mind content, a feeling of satisfaction that always came from a job well done. And then he saw it. The 2 black trash bags on the curb, next to the mailbox he had set in the ground 25 years ago. For a long moment, he simply stared, his mind refusing to process the scene. He thought perhaps a neighbor had put them out by mistake. But then he recognized the faded flannel shirt peeking out of a tear in one bag, his shirt. And then he saw the locksmith's van, and the new, gleaming brass of the lock on his front door. That is when the world tilted on its axis. Ellie appeared at the window, her face a blank mask, and he saw Julian's silhouette standing just behind her, a proprietary shadow. There were no shouts, no final, dramatic confrontation. There was only the click of the new lock engaging, a sound that severed his life in two. He did not beg or plead. The shock was a cold blanket, smothering every other emotion. He numbly loaded the 2 bags into the bed of his old Ford pickup, his movements stiff and mechanical. He got into the cab, the familiar smell of sawdust and old coffee, a strange comfort in his utter disorientation. He turned the key, the engine rumbling to life like a loyal old friend. He drove away from the house, from the street, from the only life he had ever known, without looking back. To look back would be to acknowledge the reality of the wound, and right now, the numbness was the only thing holding him together. He drove for hours, aimlessly, watching the familiar landscape of his town become alien and hostile. Every corner held a memory: the park where he'd pushed Ellie on the swings, the ice cream shop they'd frequented on hot summer nights, the school he'd picked her up from for 12 straight years. He was a ghost driving through his own past. As darkness fell, the exhaustion finally set in, a deep, crushing weariness that was more than just physical. He pulled into the parking lot of the Starlight Motel, a relic from a bygone era on the far edge of town. Its neon sign was missing a T, so it simply blinked the word Starlight into the deepening twilight. The room cost $45 in cash. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke, bleach, and a profound, lingering sadness. The carpet was thin and stained. The floral bedspread was a faded nightmare of brown and orange, and a single, bare bulb in the bathroom cast a light that made his haggard face in the mirror look like that of a stranger. He dropped the 2 trash bags onto the floor. This was his new home, a 4-walled cage of anonymity. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and began the pathetic ritual of unpacking. He pulled out a few work shirts, a pair of jeans, his worn leather wallet. Then his hand touched something hard and smooth. It was the small wooden robin he had carved for Ellie when she was 6 and heartbroken over a bird that had fallen from its nest. He had spent a week on it, sanding the tiny wings until they were smooth as silk, painting its breast a cheerful red. She had treasured it, kept it on her bedside table for years. It must have been packed by mistake. He held the small, wooden body in his palm, its painted eyes staring up at him, and the cold blanket of shock finally began to shred. He pulled out his old, battered phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled to her name. Ellie. He pressed the call button. He listened to the ring, once, twice, then a click, followed by a cold, robotic voice. The number you have dialed has been disconnected. Disconnected. He tried again, thinking it was a mistake. The same sterile message. A frantic, desperate energy surged through him. He dialed her cell phone. It went straight to a generic voicemail recording. The subscriber you have reached is not available. He tried to leave a message, to say, what? What could he possibly say? But it was futile. The mailbox is full and cannot accept new messages at this time. Full, blocked, erased. It wasn't just an eviction, it was an excommunication. That is when the pain hit. It was not a storm of rage, but a slow, crushing tide of absolute grief. He slumped back against the peeling headboard. The wooden bird clutched in his fist, and the sterile motel room dissolved into a flood of memories. He saw Clara, her face pale in the hospital bed, and heard his own voice making a promise he had now catastrophically failed to keep. He saw Ellie, a little girl with scraped knees, running into his arms on the very lawn he was now forbidden to walk on. He heard her laughter, the bright, innocent sound that had been the soundtrack of his life, now echoing like a ghost in his mind. The questions began to circle, each one a vulture tearing at him. Had his love been so worthless? Was the simple, honest life he provided such a prison that she would burn it to the ground for a stranger's promise of gold? He was a carpenter. He built things. He built a life, a home, a family. And in a single afternoon, he had learned the devastating truth that some things, once broken, could never be put back together again. The Starlight sign blinked its broken message through the thin curtains, and Arthur Miller sat through the long, lonely night, a man who had lost everything, wondering if he had ever truly had it at all. The dawn that broke over the Starlight Motel was a merciless, gray affair. It offered no warmth, no promise of a new beginning, only a flat, impartial light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the stale air of the room. Arthur had not slept. He had simply sat, a sentinel to his own ruin, the small wooden bird, a cold, smooth weight in his hand. The grief of the night had hollowed him out, leaving behind an aching void. But with the light came a flicker of something else, something deeply ingrained in his very being, the instinct to move, to do, to work. To remain in this room was to surrender, to let the grief turn to rot. He couldn't build a new life, not yet, but he could perhaps build a single, simple day. He splashed cold water on his face, gathered his 2 bags of belongings, and left the key on the nightstand. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay there. His old truck seemed to know the way, its wheels turning toward the industrial side of town, a place of warehouses and workshops, of honest noise, and the smell of diesel. He pulled up in front of a large, corrugated steel building with the words, Carter Custom Woodworks, painted in fading blue letters on the side. This was the domain of Ben Carter, a man Arthur had known for 30 years. They were friends, but also rivals in the old-fashioned, respectful way of fellow craftsmen. Ben was louder, rougher, his work less art, and more brute force functionality, but his joinery was as honest as Arthur's own. If there was one person in the world who would understand, without judgment, the language of a man who had nothing left but his hands, it was Ben. Arthur found him inside, a bear of a man with a wild gray beard, wrestling a large slab of maple through a table saw. The scream of the blade filled the vast space, and a storm of sawdust rained down. Ben finished his cut, killed the power, and the sudden silence was immense. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, and saw Arthur standing there. He didn't smile. Ben wasn't a smiling man. He just nodded, his eyes taking in Arthur's haggard appearance, the 2 trash bags he'd set down by the door, and the profound exhaustion etched into his friend's face. "You're either starting a new life or ending an old one, Art," Ben said, his voice a low rumble. "Which is it?" Arthur's voice, when it came, was hoarse, rusted from disuse. He tried to form a casual sentence, to ask for a bit of work, to pretend this was just a visit, but the words wouldn't come. The lie was too heavy. Looking at his old friend, a man who knew the difference between oak and ash just by the feel of it, pretense was impossible. "She threw me out, Ben," Arthur said, the words falling from his lips like stones. "Ellie. She got the inheritance. She and the new boyfriend, they changed the locks." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. In the stark, honest world of the workshop, those few sentences were enough. Ben's face, normally a mask of gruff indifference, hardened. He let out a string of curses, each one a sharp, angry blow against the injustice of it all. It was a rage that Arthur was too wounded to feel himself, and hearing it from his friend was strangely cathartic. It was a validation of his pain. Ben wasn't offering pity, he was offering solidarity. "That slick son of a bitch in the fancy shoes?" Ben growled. "I never liked the look of him. He looked like his hands had never touched anything real." He kicked at a pile of offcuts on the floor, his anger a force of nature in the quiet workshop. Then he stopped, looked at Arthur, and his tone softened, becoming purely practical. "All right, crying about it won't fix a damn thing. I've got a loft upstairs. Used it for storage mostly. but it's got a bed, a shower, and a hot plate. It's yours. No arguments. Arthur started to protest, the instinct of a prideful man who had never taken charity in his life. But Ben cut him off. This ain't charity, you stubborn old fool. Look at this place. I'm buried. I've got the Henderson Cabinet Commission due in 3 weeks, and my finishing guy just quit. I need your hands. I need that eye of yours that can see a millimeter flaw from across the room. I'll pay you your standard rate. The loft is just convenient. Means I can work you harder. It was the perfect offer, a lifeline disguised as a business transaction. It wasn't a place to stay, it was a place to work. It wasn't a handout, it was a job. It was a chance for Arthur to be a carpenter again, not just a victim. Arthur could only nod, a profound, unspoken gratitude passing between the two men. Ben pointed to a workbench piled high with rough-sawn cherry wood. Start with that. We need legs for the Henderson credenza. I want them perfect. Arthur walked over to the bench, his feet feeling solid on the concrete floor for the first time in days. He ran his hand over the raw lumber, feeling the familiar texture, reading the story in its grain. He picked up one of Ben's hand planes. It was heavier than his own, the balance slightly different, but it was an honest tool. He set the wood in a vise, took his stance, and drew the plane across the surface. The blade let out a soft, satisfying hiss as a perfect, paper-thin curl of cherry wood peeled away, releasing a faint, sweet scent into the air. He did it again and again, his body falling into the ancient, meditative rhythm of the work. His mind, which had been a storm of grief and confusion, began to quiet. In the workshop, there was no betrayal. There was no inheritance, no slick-talking fiancé, no daughter with cold eyes. There was only the wood, the tool, and the truth. He worked through the entire day, losing himself in the task. For the first time since the lock had clicked shut, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was focused on what he was creating. As evening fell, Ben showed him up to the loft. It was a simple, dusty space under the steel rafters, with a cot, a small table, and a single window that looked out over the industrial rooftops. But it was quiet, it was safe, and it smelled faintly of the sawdust from the workshop below. Arthur sat on the edge of the cot and looked at his hands. They were covered in a fine red dust from the cherry wood, and the old calluses felt strong and familiar. The ache in his back was from honest labor, not from despair. The hollowness in his chest was still there, a wound that would take a long, long time to heal. But surrounding it, like a sturdy new frame, was the beginning of a different feeling, a flicker of purpose, a glimmer of hope. He had lost his home, but here, among the scent of wood and the quiet hum of machinery, he had found a place to start building again. While Arthur Miller was rediscovering the humble salvation of sawdust and honest work, his daughter, Eleanor, was being baptized in the intoxicating waters of wealth. Her new life, orchestrated by Julian, began with a spectacle of consumption. They moved through the world as if it were a department store, and they had been given an infinite line of credit. The first thing to go was Ellie's sensible, reliable sedan, replaced by a low-slung German sports car that growled with an aggressive, impatient power. The car was black and gleaming, and when Ellie sat behind the wheel, the smell of expensive leather filled her senses, a potent perfume designed to erase the lingering scent of sawdust from her memory. Next came the clothes. Julian took her to exclusive boutiques with names she couldn't pronounce, places with no price tags where attendants spoke in hushed, reverent tones. She was draped in silk and cashmere, her practical, comfortable wardrobe replaced by an arsenal of high fashion. She looked at her reflection in the three-way mirrors, a stranger staring back at her in a $5,000 dress, and felt a dizzying mix of exhilaration and imposter syndrome. Julian would stand behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his reflection smiling in the mirror. "This is who you are now, Ellie," he would whisper, his voice a silken affirmation. This is the woman who was always waiting inside. The most brutal part of the transformation, however, took place at the house. Under Julian's direction, it was to be stripped of its past and reborn as a monument to their new status. A team of designers and contractors descended, their plans calling for the demolition of everything that made the house a home. The warm oak cabinets Arthur had so lovingly built were the first to be torn out, replaced by stark, white-lacquered boxes with no handles, imported from Italy. The comfortable, worn armchair where Arthur used to read the paper was unceremoniously hauled to the curb. Ellie felt a sharp, unexpected pang of guilt as she watched them take it away, a fleeting vision of her father, his reading glasses perched on his nose, flashing in her mind. Julian, sensing her hesitation, wrapped an arm around her. "We're making new memories, darling," he said smoothly, steering her away from the window. "You can't build a future if you're clinging to a museum of the past." Guilt was a ghost that haunted the edges of her new, glittering reality. It would appear at odd moments when she saw an elderly man with kind eyes in a coffee shop, or when her hand instinctively reached for the phone to tell her dad about her day. But Julian was always there, a masterful exorcist of conscience. He would distract her with a surprise gift, a reservation at an impossible-to-book restaurant, or plans for a spontaneous trip to Paris. He was building a fortress of luxury and excitement around her, its walls designed to keep the uncomfortable truths of her betrayal from ever getting in. He convinced her that the pain she had caused her father was a necessary, unavoidable byproduct of her own self-actualization. It was, he argued, the price of greatness. But while they were busy spending the money, the people who had given it to her began to call. The first call came from Mr. Abernathy, the senior partner at the law firm. His voice was dry and precise, a stark contrast to Julian's easy charm. He spoke of needing to schedule a preliminary meeting to discuss the portfolio's liabilities and to begin the due diligence process on the subsidiary holdings. Ellie, trying to sound confident, repeated the words to Julian later that evening over a dinner of champagne and oysters. Julian simply laughed, a dismissive, airy sound. "Lawyers," he said, waving his fork. "They have to justify their exorbitant fees. It's just paperwork, darling. Boilerplate stuff. They're legally obligated to cross the T's and dot the I's. Don't you worry your beautiful head about it. I'll handle the boring stuff." A few days later, another lawyer called, this one from the firm's accounting department. Her tone was more urgent. She mentioned significant outstanding debts tied to a company called Sterling Textile Manufacturing and pending litigation involving an entity named Northwood Real Estate Ventures. The names meant nothing to Ellie. When she brought them up to Julian, he rolled his eyes with theatrical annoyance. "See? This is what I'm talking about. They're just trying to scare you." Conrad Sterling was an old shark. Of course he had debts and lawsuits. All these titans of industry do. It's how they play the game. It's all just factored into the estate's value. "It means nothing." He changed the subject, pulling up a travel website on his laptop, showing her pictures of five-star resorts in the Maldives. The problem, for now, was successfully buried under the promise of white sand beaches. The calls, however, kept coming. Mr. Abernathy became more insistent, his professional courtesy fraying at the edges. He started using phrases like time-sensitive obligations and potential insolvency. Julian began to intercept the calls himself, speaking to the lawyers in a clipped, authoritative tone before ending the calls and reporting back to Ellie with a sigh. More bureaucratic nonsense. "I've got it under control," he'd say, before suggesting they go test drive a new yacht. He was building a wall not just around her conscience, but around her intellect, isolating her from the very information she needed to understand her own inheritance. Yet, a seed of unease had been planted, and it began to sprout in the quiet moments. In the middle of the night, when the thrill of the day had faded, Ellie would lie awake in the vast, unfamiliar bedroom and feel a cold knot of anxiety in her stomach. The house, despite being filled with new, expensive things, felt cavernous and empty. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive. She was living a life that was supposed to be a dream come true, a fantasy of limitless possibility. So why did she feel a constant, low-level hum of dread? She had everything she had ever thought she wanted. She had the money, the lifestyle, the sophisticated partner, but she had traded the one thing that had always made her feel safe, the unconditional, unwavering love of her father, for a kingdom built on promises. And as she lay awake in the dark, She was beginning to fear that she was not a queen in a palace, but a prisoner in a gilded cage. The glittering bubble that Ellie and Julian had constructed around themselves was not meant to last. It was a beautiful, iridescent sphere, but it was made of soap and air, and the sharp point of reality was coming for it. After a week of increasingly terse emails, Mr. Abernathy's office informed them that a meeting was no longer a request, but a legal necessity. Certain documents required an in-person signature, and the Board of Creditors was demanding a formal address from the new owner of Sterling Holdings. Julian, though annoyed at the interruption to their hedonistic schedule, was arrogant. "Fine," he told Ellie, straightening his tie in the hall mirror. "We'll go down there. I'll talk circles around these dusty old lawyers, and we'll put an end to this nonsense. We'll be sipping champagne by lunch." Oh. Their arrival at the law firm of Abernathy, Cole, and Swain was an exercise in contrast. Julian, in his sharp Italian suit and ostentatious watch, was a creature of the modern, flashy world. The law office was a temple of old, quiet power. The walls were paneled with dark mahogany that had absorbed a century of whispered secrets. The air was still and smelled of leather and old paper. There were no computers in sight, only shelves of leather-bound legal books standing in silent, solemn rows. They were led to a conference room where Mr. Abernathy was waiting. He was a small, neat man in his late 60s with thinning white hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He did not rise when they entered, but simply gestured to the two chairs opposite his massive desk, his expression unreadable. Julian began immediately, attempting to dominate the room with his aggressive charm. He spoke of their plans to streamline the portfolio and leverage the existing assets for new growth opportunities. He used his entire arsenal of business school buzzwords, painting a picture of himself as a visionary captain ready to take the helm. Mr. Abernathy listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, his gaze fixed on a point just past Julian's shoulder. He let the wave of empty rhetoric wash over him and recede, leaving a profound silence in its wake. When Julian finally finished, a self-satisfied smile on his face, Abernathy took a slow, deliberate breath. "Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Vance," the lawyer said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "It was imaginative." He then turned his full attention to Ellie, and for the first time, she felt a chill of genuine fear. His eyes were not unkind, but they were utterly devoid of illusion. "Miss Miller," he began, "I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding regarding the nature of your inheritance. A misunderstanding I am now compelled to correct." He slid a thick, bound document across the polished surface of the desk. "Let's start with the $33 million. That sum was not, as you seem to believe, a cash disbursement of profit from the estate. It was the remaining balance of a line of credit drawn down by your grandfather 2 weeks before his death, secured against the last of the company's unleveraged physical assets." Julian let out a short, sharp laugh. "A line of credit? Don't be absurd. We've seen the account statements." Abernathy did not even glance at him. "The primary asset you inherited, Miss Miller, was not a sum of money. You inherited a single entity, 100% ownership of Sterling Holdings Incorporated. The money was merely the cash it had on hand." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And Sterling Holdings is, to use the precise legal term, insolvent. It is a dying empire, and your grandfather has just handed you the crumbling throne." The lawyer went on, his voice a calm, dispassionate scalpel, dissecting their fantasy piece by piece. He detailed the labyrinth of debt. Sterling Textiles, once the flagship, was obsolete and bleeding millions a month, propped up only by illegal infusions of cash from the Employee Pension Fund, a fund that was now empty. Northwood Real Estate was a collection of toxic assets, polluted industrial sites that carried federal mandates for environmental cleanup, costing tens of millions of dollars. There were lawsuits, dozens of them, from suppliers who had never been paid, from former partners who had been swindled. The room began to feel very small, the air thick and difficult to breathe. Ellie's head was spinning. It was too much, too complex. She looked to Julian, her anchor, her expert, waiting for him to dismantle this ridiculous story. Julian was no longer smiling. His face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "This is a negotiating tactic," he stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "You're trying to devalue the estate for tax purposes." "No, Mr. Vance," Abernathy said flatly, pushing another document forward. It was a summary of liabilities. "We are not. Your total inherited debt currently stands at an estimated $94 million, with more claims being filed every day." He finally looked Julian directly in the eye. "The final, and most critical, point for you to understand, Miss Miller, is that by accepting the inheritance and by using its liquid capital to purchase, among other things, a $180,000 automobile and several pieces of designer clothing, you have legally demonstrated assumption of control. You have personally accepted full liability for the entire $94 million deficit." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a great fall, the moment after stepping off a cliff, but before hitting the ground. The dream was not just over. It had been a lie from the very beginning. It was not an inheritance. It was a curse, a poisoned chalice offered by a dead man to the granddaughter he barely knew, a final, cruel act of a loveless life. Ellie couldn't speak. She felt as though she was drowning. She looked at Julian, her eyes pleading for him to fix it, to say the magic words that would make it all go away. But the magician was gone. In his place was a cornered, panicked animal. The mask of sophistication shattered, revealing the raw, ugly face of fear and greed beneath. "94 million?" he choked out, his voice a strangled whisper. Then he turned on her, his eyes wild and accusing. "This is your family, your mess. What did you get me into? You told me your grandfather was a genius, a billionaire. Didn't you do any research? Didn't you know?" The transformation was terrifying. The man who had worshipped her, who had called her his queen, was now spitting venom at her. The word "we" had vanished from his vocabulary. It was no longer their future, their fortune. It was her family, her mess. He saw the doors of a debtor's prison slamming shut, and he was desperately looking for someone else to shove inside. Mr. Abernathy watched the exchange with the quiet disinterest of a biologist observing insects. He pushed a stack of files toward them. "The creditors require a preliminary restructuring plan within 10 business days," he said calmly. "I suggest you hire a very good bankruptcy attorney." The meeting was over. They walked out of the quiet, mahogany-paneled office and back into the bright, noisy world, but everything had changed. The ride home in the growling sports car was suffocatingly silent. Ellie stared at the man in the driver's seat, at the panicked, sneering stranger he had become, and the true horror of her situation finally dawned. She hadn't just been left a mountain of debt. She had been left to face it, utterly and completely, alone. The short drive from the lawyer's office back to the house was a journey through a vacuum. The powerful engine of the German sports car, once a thrilling roar that symbolized their ascent, was now a low, funereal hum, counting down the seconds to an inevitable explosion. They walked into the house, the cold, minimalist space that had been scrubbed clean of Arthur's touch, and the silence stretched for a moment, taut and thin, before it snapped. Julian, who had been a statue of coiled tension in the car, finally erupted. He began to pace the cavernous living room like a caged animal, his hands raking through his perfectly styled hair, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. $94 million, he repeated, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. 94 million. How could you be so stupid, Eleanor? How could you not know? He spun on her, his eyes, once so full of adoration, now spitting contempt. This is your family, your legacy of failure. You dragged me into this quicksand. I staked my reputation on you, on this deal. Ellie, still reeling from the shock, could only stare at him. The man who had meticulously built her up, who had told her she was a queen, was now systematically tearing her down, trying to salvage his own ego from the wreckage of their shared fantasy. I thought your grandfather was some kind of Midas, he sneered. Turns out he was a con artist, and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. His frantic pacing continued, his mind scrambling for an escape route. It was in this panicked rant that the truth, the real, ugly heart of his deception, finally surfaced. I knew there might be some complications, he muttered, almost to himself, his voice a low, venomous hiss. Old money always has skeletons, hidden debts. I factored that in. 10, maybe 15 million in liabilities to clean up. It's the cost of doing business. He stopped, his eyes locking onto hers, and in that moment, she saw it all. He had known. He had suspected the inheritance wasn't clean, that there were hidden risks. He had seen the warning signs in the initial paperwork that she, in her naivety, had overlooked. He had gambled, using her as his stake, assuming the final payout would be more than enough to cover any inconvenient truths. He had knowingly and willfully lied to her, not just about her father, but about the very nature of the fortune itself. He hadn't just been blinded by greed, he had been her blindfold. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her shock began to curdle into a slow, burning anger. While this snake had been whispering promises in her ear, he had been hiding the truth, playing her for a fool. His panic now shifted into a new, predatory focus. His eyes darted around the room, assessing, calculating. "There's only one way out," he said, his voice dropping, becoming urgent and conspiratorial. "We have to liquidate. Immediately. The car, the jewelry, everything of value, and this house." He gestured around the room. "This house is the only clean asset. It's in your name, free and clear. We sell it. A quick cash sale. It'll be a fire sale, but we can still get a couple of million for it. We take that money and we run. We can be in Panama by next week, untouchable." He was mapping out their escape, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, feral light. But for Ellie, something inside finally broke. Selling her father's house, the home he built, the very symbol of her betrayal, the price of her admission into this nightmare. To sell it to fund the escape of the man who had led her here, it was a line she could not cross. "No," she whispered, the word fragile but firm. Julian stopped, staring at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign language. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "I said no," Ellie repeated, a bit stronger this time, drawing strength from the depths of her own shame. "I'm not selling my father's house." Julian's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. His handsome features twisted into something ugly and menacing. He jabbed a finger in her face. "Your father's house? This is a pile of wood and nails. A worthless, sentimental shack. Are you insane? You would rather go to prison. You would rather be ruined for the rest of your life than let go of this monument to your pathetic little life." He was shouting now, his voice echoing in the sterile, empty house. When she stood her ground, her face pale but resolute, his control snapped. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh, his charm and sophistication burned away to reveal the violent thug beneath. "You are going to sell this house," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You are going to give me that money, because you owe me. You owe me for the life you've just destroyed." In that moment, the last vestiges of her affection for him died. She saw him for what he was, a parasite, a coward, and a monster. With a surge of adrenaline, she wrenched her arm free. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Get out of my house." The ensuing fight was short and ugly, a whirlwind of shouted accusations and slammed doors. It ended with Julian storming out, promising that she would regret this, that she would be nothing without him. And as the door slammed shut, plunging the house into a deafening silence, the story shifts. It travels across town, away from the cold marble and simmering panic, and settles in a place that smells of warm wood and honest labor. In Ben Carter's workshop, Arthur Miller was planing a piece of maple. The rhythmic shush of the blade was a form of meditation. In the weeks since his eviction, he had found a quiet rhythm. He would wake in the small loft apartment, make coffee on a hot plate, and be in the workshop before the sun was fully up. He and Ben worked side by side, their communication often nonverbal, a shared nod, a gesture toward a tool, a grunt of approval. They were building the Henderson cabinets, and under Arthur's meticulous guidance, they were becoming the finest work of either man's career. The wood did not lie. The tools did not deceive. A joint was either true or it was not. In the workshop, The world made sense. His grief for Ellie had not vanished, but it had settled, changing from a raging storm into a deep, abiding ache. Here, surrounded by the tangible results of his skill, he was slowly rebuilding his own foundation, rediscovering the man he was without the title of father. He was a craftsman. He was a creator. He was a survivor. Back in the minimalist mansion, Ellie stood alone in the center of the living room. Julian was gone. The silence he left behind was a terrifying, suffocating void. She was surrounded by beautiful, expensive things, each one a testament to her folly. The Italian sofa, the German car in the driveway, the silk dress she was wearing, they were not symbols of wealth, but artifacts from a shipwreck. She had lost the phantom fortune. She had lost the man she thought she loved. And worst of all, she had willingly, cruelly, thrown away the one person who had ever loved her unconditionally. She was completely, utterly alone, adrift in the ruins of her own greed. She had reached the bottom. In the world of sawdust and steel that Arthur now inhabited, news traveled differently. It wasn't through stock market tickers or financial news networks, but through the informal, grapevine telegraph of suppliers, truck drivers, and fellow tradesmen. The first tremor of Ellie's collapsing world reached him in the form of a casual remark from a lumber delivery driver. Ben was signing for a shipment of birch plywood when the driver, a talkative man named Sal, shook his head. "Glad you guys are busy," Sal said, chewing on a toothpick. "My last stop was supposed to be a Sterling Textiles warehouse. Place was a ghost town. Heard the whole parent company, Sterling Holdings, is circling the drain. Big New York money, gone bust." The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. He stopped what he was doing, a half-sanded cabinet door in his hands, and the fine dust settled around him in the suddenly silent air. Ben caught the look on his face and quickly wrapped things up with the driver. When Sal's truck rumbled away, Ben turned to Arthur, his expression grim. "Don't," he said, his voice a low warning. "Don't even think about it, Art. It's not your problem anymore." She made her bed. But Ben didn't understand. For Arthur, it wasn't that simple. His love for his daughter wasn't a contract that could be voided by a betrayal. It was more like the grain in a piece of wood. Even if you cut it, stained it, and scarred it, the grain was still there, running all the way through. The thought of Ellie, alone and facing a disaster of that magnitude, sent a cold, sharp pang of fatherly fear right through his heart. He couldn't feel satisfaction. He couldn't feel a sense of karmic justice. All he could feel was a familiar, aching worry. That evening, he couldn't rest. The need to understand, the craftsman's imperative to diagnose the point of failure, was too strong. He went down to the small, cluttered office at the back of the workshop, a room that smelled of stale coffee and motor oil, and sat down in front of Ben's old, wheezing desktop computer. This was not his world. He was a man of analog certainties, of tape measures and spirit levels. The blinking cursor on the screen felt alien, but he pushed past the discomfort, his fingers moving slowly over the keyboard as he typed in the words, "Sterling Holdings." The internet opened a door into the world that had consumed his daughter, and what he found was a labyrinth of financial jargon and corporate doublespeak. He saw articles about debt restructuring, SEC filings filled with numbers that had too many zeros, and angry message boards populated by laid-off employees. He didn't understand the complex financial instruments, but he didn't need to. He wasn't looking at the problem like a financier. He was looking at it like a carpenter. He ignored the stock charts and focused on the tangible. He searched for the company's products. He found an online catalog for Sterling Textiles and was appalled. The designs were cheap imitations of European brands, and the customer reviews were a litany of complaints about poor quality, shoddy stitching, and colors that faded after a single wash. Arthur saw it for what it was: bad workmanship. A company that had lost pride in its product, that was cutting corners, using inferior materials, and trying to hide it under a flashy label. It was the corporate equivalent of using particle board and covering it with a cheap veneer. It would fool the eye for a moment, but it would never last. Next, he looked up Northwood Real Estate. He found lists of their commercial properties and used online satellite maps to view them. He saw rusting, derelict factories with shattered windows, sprawling industrial parks with cracked pavement and weeds growing in the loading bays, and undeveloped tracts of land that sat ominously close to rivers and wetlands, marked in news articles with words like environmental contamination and EPA investigation. To Arthur, this wasn't just a collection of bad assets, it was a rotten foundation. The entire structure was built on poisoned, unstable ground. No matter how fancy the building, if the foundation was rotten, collapse was inevitable. His most important discovery, however, came from an old business magazine profile he found on his late father-in-law. The article detailed Conrad Sterling's early years. It described how the family fortune was originally built not on real estate or textiles, but on sterling fine furniture. Conrad's own father had been a master cabinet maker, an innovator who held several key patents on wood-bending techniques and durable, waterproof finishes. The original Sterling brand, the article explained, was synonymous with quality, durability, and timeless American craftsmanship. That was the bedrock of the empire. Conrad, a man with no love for the craft itself, had taken that solid, respectable business and used it as collateral to launch himself into the cutthroat world of corporate raiding and financial speculation. He had let the roots of the tree rot while he was busy selling the leaves. Sitting there in the dim light of the monitor, surrounded by the honest smell of wood, it all became clear to Arthur. The lawyers, the bankers, the creditors, they all saw an intractable financial disaster, a hopeless tangle of debt. They were trying to save a drowning man by analyzing the water. Arthur saw something different. He saw a once great company, a company built on a craft he understood to his core, that had been systematically hollowed out by greed and neglect. And he realized that the company's most valuable assets weren't on any balance sheet. It was the old patents, now likely expired, but the technology still sound. It was the original brand name, tarnished but not forgotten. It was the core principle of making something real, something that lasts. He began to print things out, using the back of old invoices for scrap paper. He made notes in his neat, blocky handwriting, creating diagrams that showed how the furniture division, the only part of the business with a solid foundation, had been starved to feed the failing textile and real estate ventures. He was not planning revenge. Revenge was a destructive act, and he was a builder. This was something else. This was preparation. He knew his daughter. He knew her pride, her stubbornness, but he also knew her heart. And he knew that when the fear and the shame became too much to bear, when the last of the fair-weather friends had vanished, she would have nowhere else to go. She would come looking for him. He didn't know if he could forgive her, not yet, but he knew, with a father's grim certainty, that he had to be ready. He had to understand the mess she was in, not to condemn her, but to know, in the starkest terms, what it would take to even begin to clean it up. He was doing what he had always done, measuring the damage, assessing the structural integrity, and seeing if there was anything left worth salvaging. Julian did not leave with a thunderous fight, but with the silent, efficient theft of a jackal cleaning a carcass. Ellie woke the next morning to a silence that felt different, heavier. A quick, frantic search of the house confirmed her fears. The sleek German sports car was gone from the garage. The velvet boxes on her dresser, which had held the diamond earrings and the designer watch he had so magnanimously gifted her, were empty. A check of her bank account provided the final, brutal confirmation. The joint account they had set up, which held the last of the accessible cash, had been cleared out. He had left her with nothing but the house, the clothes on her back, and the mountain of debt that now bore her name alone. The great love story had been a meticulously planned heist, and she was the final, empty vault. Her splendid isolation quickly became a siege. The house, once her palace, was now her prison. The landline, which had been silent for days, began to ring incessantly. On the other end were no longer polite lawyers, but harsh, aggressive men from collections agencies, their voices dripping with impatience and threats. They spoke of liens, seizures, and wage garnishments, words that were both terrifying and abstract. Then came the certified letters. Each one, delivered by a grim-faced postal worker who required her signature, felt like a new indictment. They were filled with dense, intimidating legal text. But the message was always the same. You owe us, and we are coming to collect." The days bled into one another in a gray haze of fear and paralysis. Ellie stopped answering the phone, letting it ring until the answering machine, a relic from her father's time, picked up and recorded the angry messages. She stopped opening the mail, letting the official-looking envelopes pile up on the imported marble of the front hall table like a monument to her failure. The pristine house began to reflect her internal chaos. Empty food containers littered the counters. Designer dresses lay in heaps on the floor where she had dropped them. She would wander from room to room, a ghost in her own mausoleum, touching the cold, unfamiliar furniture and feeling nothing. She would catch her reflection in the dark glass of the new television screen and see a stranger with wild, haunted eyes and pale skin. The confident, radiant queen that Julian had promised was gone. In her place was a terrified, broken girl who was beginning to understand the true cost of her choices. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 4 weeks after the day she had cast her father out. It came in the form of a bright, fluorescent pink notice taped to her front door. It was a notice of default and foreclosure from the bank. It was a public declaration of her ruin, a neon sign for the whole neighborhood to see, announcing that the millionaire in the big house was a fraud. The sight of that cheap, stark paper against the custom-made front door shattered her inertia. The shame was no longer a private, internal agony. It was a public spectacle. In that moment of absolute humiliation, a wave of despair so powerful, it buckled her knees, washed over her. And through the suffocating fog of failure, one thought, one name, surfaced like a desperate gasp for air. Dad. Finding him was a pilgrimage of shame. She got into her old car, the one Julian had called a relic, which now felt like the only honest thing she owned. Its engine started with a familiar, comforting rumble. She drove away from the manicured lawns and silent, judgmental windows of her neighborhood and headed toward the industrial side of town, a place of smokestacks and warehouses she had only ever seen from the highway. The journey was a descent, a peeling back of the layers of her own arrogant fantasy, taking her back to a world of grit and labor, the world her father had always inhabited. Using her phone, she found the address for Carter Custom Woodworks. The building was a plain, functional steel box, a world away from the architectural marvels she and Julian had admired. The air outside smelled of diesel and damp earth. She parked across the street, her heart pounding against her ribs. For a long time, she just sat there, unable to move, a coward at the gates of her only possible salvation. Through a large, dusty window, she could see inside. The workshop was a vast, chaotic space, filled with the beautiful skeletons of unfinished projects and mountains of raw lumber. And there, in a pool of light from an overhead lamp, was her father. He was bent over a workbench, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands moving with a fluid, confident grace over a piece of wood. He was not the broken, pathetic old man she had painted him, as in her mind to justify her own cruelty. He looked strong, he looked focused, he looked at peace. At one point, Ben Carter walked over, said something, and her father looked up and laughed. It was a real, genuine laugh, and the sound of it, faint even from across the street, was a dagger in her heart. He had built a life without her. He was surviving. He was whole. The narrative she had clung to, that he was a burden she had to shed to find her own life, crumbled into dust, revealing the ugly, selfish truth of what she had done. Tears streamed down her face, hot tears of shame and a grief so profound it felt like it would tear her apart. It took every ounce of courage she had left, but she finally got out of the car and walked across the street. The heavy metal door creaked as she pushed it open. The roar of machinery was deafening, and the air was thick with the rich, clean scent of cut wood, the scent of her childhood, the scent of home. She took a few hesitant steps inside. A man operating a sander saw her first and cut the power. In the sudden, ringing silence, every head turned. And then her father looked up from his workbench, and their eyes met across the sawdust-covered floor. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw no anger, no triumph, not even surprise. She saw only a deep, bone-weary sadness. That look, that quiet, sorrowful acceptance, shattered the last of her defenses. The apology she had been rehearsing in the car, the explanations, the excuses, they all evaporated. All that was left was the raw, hideous truth of her failure. A sob tore through her, a ragged, ugly sound that came from the very core of her being. Her legs gave out from under her, and she collapsed onto the dusty concrete floor, unable to stand under the crushing weight of her own guilt. She knelt there, a pathetic heap in her expensive, now filthy clothes, and held out a trembling hand. "Dad," she choked out, the word nearly unintelligible through her tears. "Dad, please, help me." The cacophony of the workshop had fallen into a silence so profound that the gentle hum of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a roar. Every eye was on the scene unfolding in the center of the room. The broken, weeping young woman in the expensive clothes, and the quiet, dust-covered man who stood before her, his face a mask of weary sorrow. Ben Carter took a half-step forward, his protective instincts on behalf of his friend flaring up, but Arthur raised a hand almost imperceptibly, a gesture that said, "Stay back, this is mine." He walked slowly toward his daughter, his work boots making no sound on the sawdust-covered concrete. He did not stoop to her level. He did not rush to comfort her. He simply stood over her, a still point in the hurricane of her despair, and waited for the first storm of sobs to pass. When she could finally draw a ragged breath, he spoke, and his voice was not the warm, gentle tone of her childhood. It was quiet, level, and devoid of pity. "Get up, Eleanor," he said. The use of her full name was a clear, sharp signal. He was not speaking to his little girl, Ellie. He was addressing the woman who had wronged him. "Get up. The floor is for scraps and sawdust, not for you." Shaking, she used a nearby workbench to pull herself to her feet. She stood before him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her designer dress rumpled and stained, a perfect portrait of ruin. He looked at her, his gaze missing nothing, and then he turned and walked toward the small, cluttered office in the corner. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. Inside the office, he didn't offer her a seat. He leaned back against a filing cabinet coated in a fine layer of dust, crossed his arms, and waited. And so, it all came pouring out. In a halting, broken voice, Ellie confessed everything. She told him about Julian's promises, about the intoxicating fantasy of wealth, about the lawyer's warnings that she had allowed to be dismissed. She told him about the $94 million debt, the foreclosure notice on the house, and Julian's final, petty theft. She spoke without excuse, without justification. It was the raw, unvarnished testimony of a fool admitting their folly, of a sinner confessing their sins. Arthur listened to it all, his expression unchanging. He was not hearing anything he hadn't already pieced together from his own research, but hearing it in her voice, hearing the genuine, soul-deep agony of her remorse, was different. He was watching the last vestiges of her pride burn away, leaving only the raw, scorched earth of her character behind. When she was finished, her voice a raw whisper, the silence returned, thick and heavy with unspoken things. She looked at him, her eyes pleading for a verdict, for any sign of what was to come. And then, he laid out his justice. It was not a justice of anger or revenge. It was the justice of a master craftsman, a justice designed not to break, but to rebuild. "I will help you," he said, and a flicker of desperate hope ignited in her chest. "But not on your terms. On mine. There are 3 conditions. You will agree to all of them, without argument, or you will walk out that door, and I will never see you again. Do you understand?" Ellie could only nod, tears welling in her eyes again. "First," he said, his voice as steady and hard as oak. "Tomorrow morning, a lawyer Ben knows will meet you at the house. You will sign a quitclaim deed, transferring the house back into my name. It is not, and never was, a financial asset to be liquidated. It is the home my wife and I built. It is the place where I raised you. You treated it like a bargaining chip. You will learn that some things have a value that cannot be measured in dollars. That is your first lesson." He let that sink in before continuing. "Second, you will not run from this. You will not hide behind bankruptcy lawyers. You will call Mr. Abernathy yourself, and you will instruct him to arrange a meeting with your primary creditors. You will stand in front of them, and you will tell them the truth, that you were a fool, that you were deceived, and that you have nothing. You will face the consequences of your actions, no matter how humiliating. Responsibility, that is your second lesson. He paused, and his gaze seemed to look straight through her, into the hollowed-out space where her character used to be. And third, he said, his voice dropping slightly, starting tomorrow, your life of leisure is over. You will be here at 6 o'clock in the morning. You will bring a lunch you made yourself. You will not be an heiress or a consultant. You will be my apprentice. Your first tool will be a broom. You will sweep this entire workshop, every corner, until a man could eat off the floor. Then you will learn how to stack and sort lumber. Then you will learn how to clean and maintain tools. Then you will learn how to sand a piece of wood without leaving a single scratch. You will work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. You will earn a wage, and from that wage, you will pay me a fair rent for the small room above this workshop. You will learn, with splinters in your fingers and an ache in your back, the true value of an honest day's work: humility. That is your third and most important lesson. He finally pushed himself off the filing cabinet and stood before her. "This is not punishment, Eleanor," he said, his voice softening for the first time, tinged with a profound sadness. "Punishment is an end. This is a beginning. Your grandfather left you a broken empire of a company. That is a financial problem. But the man you trusted and the choices you made, they left you with a broken character. That is a much more serious problem. I don't know if the company can be saved, but we are going to try to fix you. And the only way to fix something that is fundamentally broken is to strip it down to its foundation and start again, piece by honest piece." Ellie looked at the man before her, her father, whom she had thrown away like trash, and saw not a victim, but a savior. His terms were harsh, his path was grueling, but it was a path. He was offering her not an escape, but a chance at redemption. He was offering her a way back, not to the life she had, but to a life of substance and meaning. The tears that came now were not of self-pity, but of a painful, overwhelming gratitude. She couldn't speak. She could only nod her consent, a silent, binding contract. Arthur held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod in return. He placed his large, calloused hand on her shoulder for just a second. It was not a hug. It was not forgiveness. It was the firm, steadying hand of a master craftsman, acknowledging the difficult, broken material he was about to begin work on. "Go home," he said, turning to leave the office. "Be here at 6. The path to redemption is not a gentle slope. It is a steep, rugged climb, and for Eleanor, every step was paid for with sweat and splinters. The first few weeks in the workshop were a special kind of hell. Her body, accustomed to a life of ease, screamed in protest. Her hands, once soft and manicured, became a geography of blisters, cuts, and calluses. The work was monotonous, humbling, and utterly exhausting. She swept sawdust until her arms ached, stacked lumber until her back seized, and sanded planks of wood until her fingertips were numb. There were moments she wanted to quit, to run away from the smell of resin and the constant, grinding noise of machinery. But then she would see her father across the workshop, his movements economical and precise, his focus absolute, and she would feel a profound, burning shame that was a more powerful motivator than any muscle ache. She had torn his world apart, and this labor, this pain, was the only penance she could offer. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Her movements became less clumsy, more efficient. She began to understand the different textures of wood, the unique personalities of oak, cherry, and walnut. She started to feel a flicker of satisfaction in a perfectly smooth, sanded surface, a sense of pride in a neatly stacked pile of lumber. In the evenings, in the small, Spartan loft above the workshop, they would work on the other, larger problem. Arthur would spread out his notes on the small table, and using his practical, craftsman's insight, he would explain his findings. He spoke of the original sterling furniture patents, of the solid, honest business that lay buried beneath the mountain of corporate debt. Ellie, in turn, used her facility with the modern world, researching legal precedents on her laptop, organizing the chaotic financial documents into coherent spreadsheets. A new dynamic formed between them, not of a father and a penitent daughter, but of two colleagues, two builders, surveying a ruin and drawing up the blueprints for a new, smaller, more honest structure. They formed a plan not to save the entire failing empire, but to salvage its heart. They would resurrect the original sterling fine furniture brand. A year passed. It was a year of grueling work and painstaking negotiation. Armed with a solid, no-nonsense business plan that focused on quality over quantity, they managed to convince the primary creditors to partition the original furniture patents and a small workshop from the rest of the bankrupt estate in exchange for a percentage of future profits. It was a long shot, a tiny island of solvency in an ocean of debt, but it was a start. They were not rich, they were not even comfortable. They were simply two people, working side by side from dawn until dusk, trying to build something real out of the ashes of a lie. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the anniversary of Arthur being thrown out of his own home, that the final piece of the story arrived. The letter came from Mr. Pryman, Inder 280, Abernathy's office, the same cream-colored, expensive-looking envelope that had started the entire nightmare. Ellie's heart seized for a moment with a familiar dread as she handed it to her father. Arthur wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and opened it. Inside, there was a short, formal note from the lawyer, and a second, much older envelope, the paper yellowed with age, addressed to Arthur in a graceful, flowing handwriting he recognized instantly. It was from Clara. The lawyer's note explained that it had been entrusted to the firm years ago, with strict instructions to be delivered to Arthur 1 year after Conrad Sterling's will was executed. With trembling hands, Arthur read the letter from his late wife. Her voice seemed to speak to him from the page, full of the love and wisdom he remembered so well. She wrote of her love for him and her fear of her father's corrosive influence. And then came the twist, the final, secret truth that had underpinned their entire lives. She explained that before she had left her family, she had secured a portion of her own inheritance, a sum from her mother's side of the family, and placed it into a blind trust managed by an independent firm in Switzerland. It was in Arthur's name. It was untouchable by her father, and it had been quietly growing, compounding for nearly 30 years. She wrote that she never told him because she knew him. She knew his pride, his integrity, his profound need to build his own life with his own two hands. The money, she explained, was not meant to be a fortune for him to live on, but a safety net to ensure that he would always have the freedom to live the simple, honest life he cherished. Arthur finished the letter, and a slow, quiet smile spread across his face. He looked up, his eyes meeting Ellie's. The trust was now worth a staggering amount, a sum that made the $33 million that had destroyed their family look like pocket change. He had been a wealthy man all along. He could have quit work decades ago. He could have lived a life of leisure and luxury, but he had chosen the workshop. He had chosen the sawdust and the splinters. He had chosen a life of substance. Ellie looked at her father, at this quiet, humble carpenter, and finally understood. The scale of her misjudgment was catastrophic. She had pitied him for his simplicity, scorned him for his lack of ambition. She had believed that money was power, and that he had none. She had been wrong. Her father's wealth was never in a bank account. It was in his hands, in his character, in his unwavering integrity. He had been the richest man she had ever known, and she had been too blind to see it. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the workbench. He didn't speak of paying off the debts or buying a new house. The money changed nothing because he had never needed it. He simply picked up a piece of sandpaper and turned back to the cabinet door he had been finishing. "Well," he said softly, "let's get back to work." And in that moment, the true lesson of their story settled. True wealth is not a number in a ledger. It is the calluses on your hands, the truth in your heart, and the quiet dignity you build for yourself, one honest day at a time. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long. For in that silence, they are not merely forging patience, they are building a foundation so strong that no storm of money or betrayal can ever bring it down. Thank you for listening. Join us again for the next story from GIADT NHUS, where the deepest family secrets always find their way into the light.